November 9th, 1976, 9:15 p.m. Elvis Presley was 45 minutes into his Las Vegas concert at the Las Vegas Hilton, performing for a packed house of over 2,000 fans. He was in the middle of Burning Love, ironically enough, when he noticed Joe Esposito, his road manager, standing in the wings making urgent gestures. Elvis kept singing, kept performing, but his eyes stayed on Joe. Something was wrong. Joe never interrupted shows unless it was an emergency. Elvis finished Burning Love, took his usual pause to drink water and talk to the audience, and signaled for the band to start the next song while he walked to the edge of the stage closest to the wings. Joe approached, his face pale, and whispered urgently, "Elvis, I need to tell you something. It's important." "What is it?" Elvis asked, still smiling for the audience, maintaining his stage presence even as anxiety spiked through his system. "Graceland's on fire. There's a major fire at Graceland right now." Elvis's smile faltered for just a second. Then he grabbed Joe's arm. "Lisa Marie? She's not there. She's with Priscilla in Los Angeles. Nobody's hurt." "How bad?" "Bad." Vernon called. "The fire department's there now. It's mostly in the music wing, but it's spreading." Elvis stood there for a moment, his mind racing through calculations. Graceland was on fire. His home, the place he'd bought for his mother, the mansion that represented everything he'd achieved, was burning. The music room with his instruments, his records, his memories, the house where his mother had lived her last years, the place that was more than a home. It was a symbol, a sanctuary. But he was on stage, in the middle of a concert, with 2,000 people who'd paid to see him perform. "Is anyone in danger?" Elvis asked. "No, everyone got out. It's just property damage at this point." Elvis nodded slowly. Then he turned back to the audience, his decision made. "I'm finishing the show." Joe stared at him in disbelief. "Elvis, your house is on fire. Graceland is burning right now. We can cancel the rest of the show. People will understand. This is a legitimate emergency." "No," Elvis said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "These people bought tickets weeks ago. They got babysitters, took time off work, drove from out of town, spent money they probably don't have extra of to see this show. I'm not going to cheat them out of what they paid for because of something I can't control from here anyway. I'll finish the show exactly as planned, then I'll deal with Graceland." Elvis walked back to center stage, and the band, which had been vamping through an instrumental section, smoothly transitioned into the next song. Elvis sang "My Way," and nobody in the audience had any idea that while he was performing, his home was burning 1,500 miles away in Memphis. For the next 90 minutes, Elvis gave one of the most professional performances of his career. He sang every scheduled song. He joked with the audience. He flirted with women in the front row. He told stories between numbers. He performed encores. To everyone watching, it was a typical Elvis show, maybe even better than typical. Elvis seemed focused, energetic, present in a way he hadn't been in some recent performances. But backstage, his crew knew the truth. During costume changes and brief breaks between songs, Joe would update Elvis on the fire. "They've got it under control now. The music room is destroyed. Your gold record's melted. Some of the recordings are gone." Each update was a knife in Elvis's heart, but he never let it show on stage. Charlie Hodge, Elvis's guitarist and longtime friend, watched from the wings and later said it was the most incredible display of professionalism he'd ever witnessed. "Elvis was dying inside," Charlie said in a 1985 interview. "I could see it in his eyes when he'd come off stage between songs. But the moment he stepped back out there, he was Elvis Presley the performer. Not a crack in the facade, not a moment where the audience could tell something was wrong." The backup singers noticed it too. Kathy Westmoreland, who'd worked with Elvis for years, said she could hear the tension in his voice on certain songs, the way he'd grip the microphone a little tighter, the way he'd close his eyes and seem to be somewhere else for a moment before snapping back to the performance. But if you weren't looking for it, if you didn't know him intimately, you'd never see the cracks. The concert ended at 11 p.m. to thunderous applause and standing ovations. Elvis took his final bows, waved to the audience with his trademark smile, thanked them profusely for coming, told them he loved them, and walked off stage with the same charisma and energy he'd displayed all night. The moment he was out of sight of the audience, completely hidden behind the stage curtains, the smile disappeared instantly as if someone had flipped a switch. Elvis went straight to his dressing room without speaking to anyone, shut the door, and called Graceland immediately. Vernon answered on the first ring, his voice rough from smoke inhalation and tears. "Elvis, thank God. Are you okay? We've been trying to reach you." "Am I okay?" Elvis said, his voice breaking slightly. "Dad, forget about me. Is the house still standing?" "Tell me the truth." "Yeah, it's still standing. The structure is solid. But son, the music room is gone. I mean really gone. Completely destroyed. The fire started in the electrical system in that wing, and by the time the fire department got here and got it under control, it had spread through the whole room. Your pianos, your guitars, all the recording equipment. The gold records on the wall, they melted from the heat. Some of your personal recordings, the tapes you kept in there, they're destroyed beyond recovery." Elvis sat down heavily, the weight of what he was hearing finally hitting him now that he didn't have to maintain his performance persona. "What about Mama's things? The room where she stayed?" "That's fine. The fire didn't get to the second floor. It was contained to the music wing and part of the first floor." "How did it start?" "Electrical fire. Old wiring, they think. You know that wing has the original wiring from when we first moved in. Should have been updated years ago." Elvis felt guilt crash over him. He'd known the wiring in that part of the house was old. He'd been meaning to have it checked, to have updates done. But he'd been touring constantly, hadn't been home enough to oversee renovations, kept putting it off. And now the fire had destroyed irreplaceable things because he'd been negligent. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have fixed the wiring. I should have—" "Don't," Vernon interrupted. "This isn't your fault. It's just bad luck. These things happen." But Elvis knew better. He'd had the resources to prevent this. He'd just been too busy, too distracted, too overwhelmed by touring and prescriptions and the constant demands of being Elvis Presley to take care of his own home. Elvis hung up with his father and sat alone in his dressing room for a long time. His crew gave him space, understanding he needed to process what had happened. Finally, Joe Esposito knocked and entered. "You okay, boss?" "No," Elvis said honestly, "but I will be. I need to get to Memphis. Can you arrange a flight tonight?" "Already done. Plane's ready whenever you are." Elvis stood up, looking at himself in the mirror. He was still in his stage jumpsuit, still had the heavy stage makeup on. He looked like Elvis Presley, the performer. But he felt like a man who'd just lost something he couldn't replace. "Joe, why did I finish the show? My house was burning, and I just kept singing like nothing was wrong. What kind of person does that?" Joe sat down in one of the dressing room chairs. "The kind of person who understands that 2,000 people counted on you tonight. The kind of person who keeps his commitments even when it's hard. The kind of person who knows the difference between what he can control and what he can't. I could have stopped the show, could have gotten on a plane hours ago. Maybe I could have saved something. Elvis, by the time I told you about the fire, it was already contained. You being there wouldn't have changed anything except that 2,000 people would have had a canceled show. You made the right call." Elvis wasn't so sure, but he changed clothes, washed off the makeup, and headed to the airport. Elvis arrived at Graceland at 4 a.m. Even in the dark, he could smell the smoke, could see the damage to the music wing. He stood outside for a long time before going in, not ready to see what he'd lost. Vernon came out to meet him. Father and son stood together in the pre-dawn darkness, looking at the burned section of the house. "It's just things," Vernon said. "Things can be replaced." "Not all of them," Elvis said. "Not the recordings I made with Mama, not the first guitar you bought me, not the piano I wrote songs on." Vernon didn't have an answer for that. He just put his arm around his son's shoulders. When the sun came up, Elvis finally went inside to survey the damage. The music room was devastated. The ceiling had collapsed in places. His instruments were charred beyond recognition. The walls were black with soot. Gold records had melted into abstract sculptures. The recording equipment was destroyed. But the worst loss was the tapes. Elvis had kept personal recordings in that room, things he'd never released. Recordings of him singing with his mother, early versions of songs, jam sessions with friends, conversations he'd recorded. All gone, turned to ash, or melted into unplayable masses. Elvis stood in the ruins of his music room and cried for the first time since his mother's death, not just for what he'd lost in the fire, but for everything. For the years of touring that had kept him away from home, for the prescription drugs that had numbed him to the point where he couldn't take care of basic things like updating electrical wiring, for the career that had given him everything but also taken everything. Elvis never used the music room again. He had it rebuilt, had it restored, to look almost exactly like it had before the fire. But he couldn't go in there. The space was contaminated by loss, by guilt, by the memory of getting the news on stage and having to keep performing while his home burned. He started using other spaces in Graceland for music, but it wasn't the same. That music room had been special, the first room he'd designed specifically for making music when he'd bought the house. It had been where he'd felt most creative, most himself. And now he couldn't even walk through the door without feeling the weight of what had been lost. In interviews after the fire, Elvis was asked about it occasionally. He'd always downplay the significance, say it was just property damage, that everyone was safe, and that's what mattered. But people close to him knew the fire had devastated him more than he let on. Kathy Westmoreland, in her memoir, wrote about the change she saw in Elvis after the Graceland fire. He'd already been struggling with depression and drug dependency, she wrote, but after the fire, something shifted. It was like he'd lost his anchor, his safe place. Graceland had represented home, success, security. And now, part of it was gone, destroyed while he was on stage performing. I think he felt guilty for finishing the show, like he'd chosen his career over his home, even though logically he knew there was nothing he could have done. Charlie Hodge said that Elvis talked about the fire often in his final months. He'd bring it up at random times, Charlie recalled. We'd be talking about something else, and he'd suddenly say, "You remember the night Graceland burned? I should have stopped the show." I must have told him 100 times that he'd made the right decision, that those fans deserved the show they paid for. But I don't think he ever believed it. The story of Elvis performing while Graceland burned became a symbol of his dedication to his craft and his fans. It showed a professionalism that transcended personal crisis, a commitment to honoring his obligations even when every instinct screamed to abandon the stage and rush home. But it also highlighted the impossible position Elvis found himself in during his final years. He was trapped by his own success, by the expectations of fans and promoters, by the constant pressure to perform regardless of physical or emotional state. He couldn't be human, couldn't have emergencies or breakdowns, couldn't prioritize his personal life over his professional obligations. The fire at Graceland wasn't just about property damage. It was about what Elvis had sacrificed for his career. His home, his sanctuary, the place that should have been separate from his public life, was burning. And he couldn't go to it, couldn't protect it, couldn't even acknowledge it publicly because he had a show to finish. In the 9 months between the fire and his death, Elvis performed over 70 concerts. He was exhausted, sick, heavily dependent on prescription drugs and grieving losses both tangible and intangible. But he kept performing, kept honoring his commitments, kept being Elvis Presley the entertainer even when Elvis the man was breaking apart. The concert he performed while his house was burning was perhaps the perfect metaphor for his final years. Maintaining the performance while everything behind the scenes was falling apart, smiling for the audience while personally devastated, choosing professional obligation over personal need over and over until there was nothing left. When Elvis died on August 16, 1977, the music room at Graceland was still rebuilt but unused. He'd never gone back in after seeing the fire damage. That space, which had once represented his creativity and passion, had become a monument to loss, just like Elvis himself had become in those final years. A monument to what he'd been, performing the same songs over and over while the person underneath the performance slowly disappeared. The concert Elvis performed while his house was burning showed his professionalism, his dedication, his commitment to his fans. But it also showed the cost of that dedication, the price of always putting the show first, the tragedy of a man who couldn't allow himself to be human even when his home was literally burning down. And that cost, that price, that tragedy was measured not just in melted gold records and destroyed recordings, but in the exhaustion and despair that would consume Elvis Presley in the months that followed, leading to his death in the very house he'd saved by finishing the show that night.